To President Lacey and to the administration and faculty, staff, and students at Missouri Baptist University. It's been not just a delight, but a memorable 3 days to share this time with you. I appreciate the opportunity to be in a number of classes, to have conversation with several dozen of you as students, and to share in the embracing environment that is here at Missouri Baptist University. So Dr. Lacey, to you and to everyone, thank you for this invitation. I'll be returning shortly to George W. Truett Theological Seminary, where I teach, and I'd be remiss if I didn't underscore to any of you, if you have interest in seminary education, getting in contact with us. We'd be happy to tell you more about what we do at Truett Seminary in preparing women and men for Christian ministry. Today, if I could write over what I want to say, it might just be the word Nike. Just do it. I enjoy stories about people willing to take a risk. There he was in the box hanging from a wire, going from the floor of the desert in Albuquerque, New Mexico, up to the top of Sandia Peak. There's a tramway, a box hanging on a wire that holds 50 people. You buy your ticket, you get on, and you're raised up from the floor up to the top of Sandia Peak, a mountain. That day, everyone in the box was interested because one young man got on with a long canvas bag, zipped closed. It's a little edgy to be in that box anyway as the wind blows it back and forth hanging on the cable. It made everyone even yet still edgier to wonder what is in that canvas bag, long, zipped up. We got to the top, we watched. He went over to the edge of the peak, unzipped it, got out a metal framework with some gossamer thin fabric on it, strapped it on, and jumped off the mountain. It's a hang glider. He did that risking that the warm thermal currents coming up from the valley floor below would catch him. And we watched him as he rode them down toward Albuquerque in the basin beneath that peak. I suppose he did it because of the thrill, the rush, the adrenaline of taking that kind of risk. One of my colleagues at Truett, Dr. Liling Nan, a petite Asian lady, is a rock climber. Dr. Nan wedges her fingers and toes into the cracks and crevices of sheer cliffs and pulls herself up. Those of us who watch her practice for it, no less do it, are astonished at her willingness to take that kind of risk. They say 250,000 people a year take the risk of running the rapids on the Colorado River, strapped into boats with life preservers on. It's some level of risk. Yet there are different kinds. I have a friend, a wealthy man, who every day takes the risk of turning on CNBC, calling his broker, and does a financial transaction called covered calls. He puts millions of dollars into the market, and by a certain technique with these covered calls, some days can make $1 million, other days lose $1 million. He doesn't need to do any of it, but he enjoys doing it because of the sense of risk. There's something about some of us that just enjoys taking risk. I wonder how it is that the Lord Jesus Christ ever got identified with playing it safe. Somebody said the motto of a lot of Christians is come weal or woe, The only status we know is quo. Buckner Fanning, a pastor friend of mine in Texas, hung a banner up in front of the Trinity Baptist Church and said, "The 7 last words of the church. We never did it that way before." Jesus confronts you from every page of the Gospels, not as someone who calls you to a life of safety first, but as the Lord of the risk, who dared to walk up to people he hardly knew and said, "Drop everything you're doing and follow me and see what happens." On Tuesday, before he risked the cross on Friday, he spoke some stories that underscore that risk. I'm going to read this suggestively because you've probably heard it exhaustively. He said in Matthew 25, "It," meaning his reign, his rule, his leadership in your life, "it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each in proportion to his ability. Then he went away. The one who'd received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 talents more, but the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them." Interesting thing about Jesus' stories is a lot of them don't sound religious at all. Here is the owner of a big landed estate. He has a household staff, maybe dozens of people. He calls in 3 of them and he gives his stuff to them. And he says, "You take my stuff, and while I'm gone, you go out and risk it with my stuff. When I get back, I want to have some more stuff." There's nothing particularly religious sounding about that. In fact, Jesus' stories are almost always secular stories that tease your mind into active thought. What's he really talking about here? Well, one thing he's talking about is being willing to participate in what God is doing rather than merely watching it. The 5-talent servant and the 2-talent servant in this are simply window dressing. They're kind of dramatic persons to set off in relief the 1-talent servant who, even though he had less to lose, did nothing with it. Let me give a parenthesis here. This word talent often confuses people because we think what this is about is what we do just with our talents. If I sing or play an instrument or if I speak or whatever. No, it was the largest coin minted in the Greco-Roman world. 1 of them was of great significance. 5 of them was a great deal of money. He's talking about risking that. 5 talents, 2 talents. They set off in relief this 1-talent man who was incarcerated in his own inertia, who was stultified. He lived in stagnation. Even though he had less to lose, he did nothing with the stuff of life that had been given to him. In fact, he even bragged on himself later. He was careful with it. He went out and buried it, but he didn't do anything with it. You know, life hands all of us the stuff of life. What I mean stuff, I mean our natural gifts, aptitudes, talents, endowments, the stuff that's in us by nature and by nurture, our friendship, our networks, the opportunity to train in an education institution like this. Everything that life hands you is the stuff that you've got. Elsewhere, Jesus said, if you seek to save that stuff, you'll lose it. But if you lose it for his sake in the Gospels, you'll find out what life is all about. I can almost imagine this 1-talent servant who didn't want to do anything with the stuff of life. I can I can watch him making excuses. He says that 5-talent servant. Yes. If I had his connections, I could take a risk too. He has a golden parachute. His father's Rabbi Smelfungus, head of the synagogue. And he explains away why somebody else can risk. Looks at the 2-talent servant and says, oh, everybody knows what kind of person he is. Shallow, superficial, backslapper. If I had that kind of personality, I could risk too. And life passes by while the 1-talent servant excuses himself by explaining away everybody else. Do you know the position of being a watcher, a bench warmer, a spectator, an observer is really the sorriest position from which to observe anything? The American short story writer from Baltimore, Edgar Allan Poe, wrote a story about a family out in an inland flatland state, probably Kansas somewhere, for whom every year a big moment was the arrival of a mail-order catalog. Long before there was internet shopping, people used to get great big books, and particularly people who lived in rural areas were happy to get the catalog. This family would order a family gift every year. That year they ordered a collapsible telescope to look across the flatlands. When it came out on the rural route, they eagerly unwrapped it, looked out the farmhouse window, and saw a hideous monster perched on top of the barn. They said, we got this thing just in time. They lowered the window shade, locked the windows, locked the doors, waited for doomsday, until the weest little boy in the family saw that it was not a hideous monster on the barn. It was a praying mantis on the window screen, magnified out of all proportion. The poorest way to look at life is looking at it as a mere spectator or an observer, rather than a real participant about what is going on. It'll give you a jaundiced, limited view that will put you in the paralysis of analysis. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of wisdom, chapter 11 and verse 4, it says, those who look at the wind will never sow, and those who look at the rain will never reap. It's another metaphor or image out of the ancient farming world. Here's a farmer, has a little rocky patch. His wife and children are starving. They're begging him to eat the seed grain, and he knows they can't eat it because if he doesn't sow, they'll all starve the next year. They didn't have any drills or plows. You sowed by broadcasting it with your hand. What if right when I'm about to plant it, a wind blows and blows my seed over into the next guy's farm? So he does nothing. Waiting for the perfect moment, he does nothing. At the other end of the cycle, Ecclesiastes 11:4 says, he who looks at the clouds won't reap. They would cradle that grain in their arm and cut it by hand. The disaster was if it rained on it, because it would wet it and the grain would mildew and be lost. So waiting until there's not a cloud in the sky and it's the perfect time, he does nothing. Let me give you a handle on life that I've discovered, and that is if you wait for the perfect time to do anything, you'll likely never do anything. There's hardly ever a perfect time to get a degree or to get a graduate degree. Frankly, there's usually not a perfect time to get married. There's not a perfect time to decide where you're going to move and work. Life doesn't hand you perfect times. What it does hand you is sometimes that seem to be better than others, and Jesus says, now, follow me. Reinhold Niebuhr, who used to be an American public intellectual and theologian, told a story about a lad who wanted to slip away from a little town because he'd always dreamed on going out to sea on a tall-masted sailing ship. He'd never seen the sea. He slipped onto a boxcar, as people used to do. My father did that when he was 16 years old and rode the boxcar all the way to the other coast. This kid did that, lied about his age, became an apprentice sailor. Third day out to sea, the captain said, climb up the mast and assume the watch at the crow's nest. Well, he didn't bargain for that. He'd never been that far up anything in his life. And halfway up the mast, he just clutched it. Neither up nor down. He was afraid to go down because he feared the ridicule of the seasoned salt sailors on the deck. They were mocking him in his phobia. But he was also afraid to go up because he'd never been that high before in his life. So he took an option that was not an option, neither up nor down. He just held on halfway. Jesus calls on you to lean into his promises so that you don't freeze neither up nor down, but just do it. In fact, risk doing something rather than nothing. A friend of mine used to say halitosis is better than no breath at all. Jesus seems to over and over say, do something. The rabbis had a parable. It was not unlike the parable that Jesus told, except it was upside down. The rabbis told a parable like this. They said there was a man who divided up his substance among his servants. One of the servants risked it and lost it. The other one buried it and did nothing with it. When that man returned to settle accounts, the one who risked it and lost it, he visited with punishment, but the one who did nothing, he promoted to be the head of his house. A parable which seems to say zero is best. No, Jesus made their heroes his villains and their villains his heroes. Jesus said to be prudent and careful but useless is as far down as you can go in my values. Read the rest of this parable. Some of the toughest stuff Jesus ever said was about this man who just hid it and did nothing with it. He said, you wicked, lazy servant, take away what he had and give it to the one who was willing to risk it. Now, we think wicked and lazy belongs to folks like murderers or adulterers or embezzlers, but Jesus looked at this person who did nothing with the stuff of life and said, that's kin to the devil. That word wicked, poneros in Greek, is the same word in the Lord's Prayer. Deliver us from the evil one, because he did nothing. Down in Texas, where I'm from, I'm Texas born, Texas bred. When I die, be Texas dead. Down in Texas, one of our state heroes is Davy Crockett. Left Tennessee, came to the Alamo, and there, in the slaughter by Santa Ana, he died. But Davy Crockett reputedly had a statement, look before you leap. Jesus didn't say that. Sometimes Jesus has the right to come up to you and say, leap, because I am Lord. I don't know how we've tamed Jesus as much as we have. The Jesus of the Gospels was never an endorser of the status quo. He was the kind of Lord who would walk up to a man like Matthew who had it made and say, leave it and follow me. The kind of Lord who would walk up to that wee little marginalized tax collector named Zacchaeus who was up a tree and out on a limb in his life and say, come down, Zach. I'm coming to your house and things are going to be different. This morning, I got up and read words written by a man whose words I have read since I sat in the same kind of place you're sitting at. His name is Oswald Chambers. He wrote a little book called My Utmost for His Highest. Some people think other than the Bible, it's the most read piece of Christian literature in the world. I doubt that less than 1 million people got up and read his words today. Oswald was an artist, a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, fine painter, graphic artist too. He was called to ministry. He became a minister and in World War I became a volunteer chaplain to go to Egypt and in a little wooden hut teach the Bible to teenagers who were about to go to the front and be mowed down in the trenches in World War I. Oswald didn't even know what he was going to do next, but he went supporting himself to that little hut near the pyramids of Giza outside of Cairo, and with a handful of young men taught them the Bible. He was a newlywed, and his wife, Gertrude, had a gift of writing down shorthand. She could take it down at 150 words a minute, and while he was saying those words to a handful of soldiers, she was writing them down. Oswald was suddenly stricken with appendicitis. He could have saved his life, but he didn't want to take the bed of a wounded soldier, and so he died of preventable appendicitis. I visited his grave in the Cairo Military Cemetery. Sat down there on that green grass in front of that little white tombstone, and somebody had already been there that morning leaving flowers, because millions of people get up every morning and read those words that his wife wrote down in that little hut. As a young widow with a baby, she went back to Oxford, had to run a boarding house to keep life together, but it would go down to the basement and on a manual typewriter divide those notes up into 365 daily readings. Millions of people read those and are drawn closer to Christ. But you know why it happened? It happened because a 44-year-old man was willing to drop what he was doing and risk being a chaplain to the YMCA, but by God's synchronicity, God's bringing together random events, he married a woman who was a tremendous shorthand taker, and she had the desire in her heart to divide those things up and give them to the world. A.N. Whitehead said, "A wise man is a man who plants shade trees he'll never sit under." And that's exactly what Oswald did, because he did something. Jesus also said in this, risk taking responsibility rather than placing blame, because someday you'll have to give an account for it. Verse 19, after a long time, the master of those servants returned. Those of us who believe in the Christian faith don't think life is just a circle, the same old, same old. We believe life is linear, heading toward a telos, an end, an omega point, when Jesus will return and our lives will give an account. Now, if you're not a Christian, that's not your worldview probably, but for those of us who are Christians, that is our worldview, that there is an accounting. And in this accounting, it's interesting, every one of these is nailed to what they did with the stuff of life. The 5-talent servant gladly says, look, I took this, I risked it, here's 10. Jesus puts on the word of his master, wonderful words, well done, high five. Look, you've been faithful, here's some more stuff, do it again. The 2-talent servant. Same words to that 2-talent servant that he said to the 5-talent servant. He didn't say to that 2-talent servant, you 2-talent loser, you didn't do anything in comparison to that 5-talent servant. No. He said, well done. Well done, good, faithful, welcome. Here's some more. Now let me give you some good news. You vary in capacity to risk. For some of you to cross the street and talk to somebody about your faith might be a risk. For some of you to cross the city and help in a clinic might be a risk. For others of you, you wouldn't take a risk until you crossed the world and buried your life alive somewhere for a lifetime. I don't know what your risk threshold is, 1, 2, or 5, but I do know this. All of those who are willing to take a risk belong to the same order of heroes when it comes to Jesus. That's why it was sad when this 1-talent servant reluctantly shows up and says, look, here's what you gave me. He's so perfectly modern, or you might say postmodern. If you read the parable, he begins to blame his own fears. He said, I was afraid, and I hid it. Interestingly, Jesus didn't put any words of sympathy in this master's mouth about fear. Master didn't say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know you were afraid." Not a word. In fact, he said, "You evil, slothful servant, you've turned your life into a zero." There's more than 800 named phobias. You can Google them. Some of them are phobias well known: claustrophobia, agoraphobia. Some of them a little less known: herpetophobia, that's fear of snakes; arachnophobia, fear of spiders. I've got that one. There's even homilophobia. That's fear of sermons. I don't know what phobia this man had. But when it came time for the weigh-in and the payoff, his fear was not accepted. But then, even worse than that, he indicted his Lord. He said, "You're a hard man. You try to reap where you haven't sown." His Lord was anything other than a hard man. He had the kind of Lord about whom James, the younger half-brother of Jesus, said, "Every good and every perfect gift comes from a Father of light, with whom there's not a shifting shadow of change." He was a generous, good, trusting Lord. But this man indicted him and said, "You're hard. Life's hard. I was afraid. I just hid it." Let me tell you a secret. This is volume 2 of Gregory's Suppositions on the Parables. I think if that one-talent servant has said, "Lord, I went out and risked it, and I lost it, but I tried." You know what I think? I think his Lord would have said, "Well done. I know you had it in your heart." Students, if God doesn't give you boulders, if he gives you pebbles, he doesn't expect you to build pyramids. He expects you to build something. If he gives you cotton thread, he doesn't expect you to weave golden garments. But he expects something. Life is not a rehearsal. This is the real show. And oh, how we find that out. You say, "But what if I risk it and I don't get where I intended?" Did you ever hear of William Borden? I don't know if the name's as famous as it was some years ago. The Borden family was a dairy family. They used to have an icon they used in advertisements, Elsie the cow. I don't know, I guess Elsie's gone now, but the Bordens made millions of dollars in dairy products. Chicago family, the son of the Bordens was a young man named William. In high school, he gave his life to Christ. And in his Bible, he wrote, after he was challenged by some of his friends, "No reserve." Borden went off to Yale, class of 1904. There were 1,200 students at Yale at that time. He was such an influence that 90% of the students at Yale started going to prayer meetings that William Borden and his friends started at Yale. He was the very epitome of Christian faith, but some of his Yale friends said, "Look, you can't be a minister. You're going to inherit millions of dollars." And they challenged him. And after praying, he wrote in his Bible under no reserve the words, "No retreat." He decided to become a missionary to Western China. Then his family questioned him. When he set sail, the nation's newspapers had headlines, "Millionaire Missionary Leaves the Country." When he got to Cairo, he contracted spinal meningitis. He was there to study Chinese part of the way to the mission. In a hotel room, or rather in a hospital room by himself, William Borden passed from time into eternity in his 20s. When they found that Bible, underneath those words, "No reserve, no retreat," Bill Borden wrote these words: no regrets. I've known some folks who got quite old whose motto was to play it safe. I guess they thought the kingdom of God was that sort of place. And they had some regrets. I've watched enough followers of Jesus to know that those willing to risk for him can always write what Bill Borden wrote: no reserve, no retreat, and no regret. If you claim to be a follower of Jesus, when he says something, remember Nike. Just do it. Lord, here we are. Yeah, sometimes we're afraid. I am, these are. Life hands us risk. But Lord, may we hear that voice with a Galilean accent come across the miles and across the centuries. Oh God, help us to hear it. Your voice, that voice that walked up and said, drop it and follow me. We thank you that you've already tilted the game in favor of those who are willing to risk for your sake. Lord, when they write our epitaph, keep us from the nothingness of simply played it safe. And when our day is done and our race is run, when we cross the finish line, help us to meet you and hear those words, well done, welcome. And grant that we'd trust in you and just do it for Jesus' sake.